This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Chris Stott, Chair and CEO of Lonestar Data Holdings. The topic, can the moon protect Earth's data? Stott explains how lunar storage could be humanity's best defense against a digital catastrophe. Then our hosts discuss the latest news, including a flurry of commercial space announcements.
Chris Stott, it is good to see you again.
You too, David. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I think the last time I saw you was inside a surfer's dive in Cocoa Beach in Florida, if I recall correctly. You were, at that point, we were both there for the Intuitive Machines IM-1 mission that was carrying a bunch of payloads, including yours, to the lunar surface. It's quite a bit has happened since then.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Well, they fantastic Cafe Surfinista, giving them a free plug there. Amazing coffee in Cocoa Beach. But you're right. What a great place to meet and hang out and just be surrounded by a bunch of professional surfers and talk about surfing in space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that mission, if I'm not mistaken, like you had a software application that was loaded on the craft's sort of onboard computer that sort of hoped to serve as sort of the initial makings of a lunar data center, essentially. And so, we've since had IM-2, which I've seen you discussing quite a bit about, but I think maybe that's where we can start. We can talk about that mission, but also maybe more fundamentally what we're trying to do here in terms of Lonestar Data Holdings, which is your company there. Like, what problem are you trying to solve that's not solved terrestrially or orbitally in terms of sort of those data solutions?
No, would love to. So, David, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. I mean, you're an expert here too. So, I mean, so please lead me and let's talk about IM-1, IM-2, what's happening in the industry. Why is all of a sudden this becoming a thing in the industry too? What's driving that? Let's do that.
So let's get into IM-2. Let's talk about IM-2. What was the payload there? What was accomplished?
Oh, payload there was our first hardware and software. We tested all the way to the moon. We were switched on cislunar L1, 39 orbits. We had storage on board for disaster recovery testing and storage on board for 9 governments, including the state of Florida. Right. We were testing a delay tolerant network for Vint-Cerf, press release coming out on that. We did a knowledge graph for Valkyrie Intelligence, part of an LLM, large language model, very fundamental part. We were running a RISC-V chip from Microsemi. SkyCorp built that for us, that payload. We had 8 terabytes on board from Phison. Oh my gosh. Oh, we had Starfield from Bethesda Games. We were doing all sorts of things with Imagine Dragons. We had commercial, we had government. We were testing everything we need for these next stage of missions. And everything worked. And that's the most important part for us.
I think that is a fundamental part. But I think maybe the broader piece of this is actually what you're doing here. Because when we talk about data processing and data storage and sort of the guts of what it takes to start to build sustainable either machine presence on the lunar surface or eventually human presence on the lunar surface, a core function of this is obviously data. And what your company is doing, I think, is so interesting in terms of creating that sort of in situ capacity that deals with some of the latency problems that you might have operating the moon otherwise, but just a whole host of other conditions that you have to contend with by putting data centers on the lunar surface, but not just the lunar surface, the lunar South Pole, which is just, I mean, it is just a whole different ball of wax in terms of the difficulty of operating there. So I wonder if we can maybe get into that aspect of it first, because just technically what you have to achieve there in order to get these data centers is a tall order.
Oh no, well, thank you. And could we pick a harder place to go on the moon? I'm like, really, guys, really? How about far side South Pole next time? I mean, oh my gosh, guys, come on. And so that was fascinating because that's where the Intuitive Machines were our ride to the moon under the NASA CLIPS program we're going. So we were kind of tagging along on that one. And we were fortunate. We had a subcontractor who built the hardware for us called SkyCorp, then Space Built Now. Dennis
Wingo's team, right?
Yeah, right. And there's probably nothing that Dennis Wingo doesn't know about the moon. Yeah. So it was ideal. They were the ideal partner for this. They flew an RMAS radiation sensor inside as an inboard hosted payload with us too, to checking everything out. No, you're right. Well, a couple of things there to unpack. Right. First thing to unpack, when we look at all the technologies that are being put forward to go to the moon, we were always really confused. We see this great list from NASA, And we go, okay, that's wonderful. Yeah, robotics, 3D printing, in-situ resource utilization. And we're like, where's the IT?
Right.
Where's the information technology? Guys, you need compute and data centers on the edge to run all of this, but it's not listed anywhere. You put the word data in, and they're not, I think it maybe gets a mention, but it's not data centers, it's not data as we would talk about it. They're talking about science data.
Right.
It's like we forgot to take the internet with us. And
Yeah.
so that's part of what we're doing. But our main market is terrestrial. And we just look at Earth's market there, and we look at the moon as Earth's largest satellite, and looking back. And so our next set of missions, we're doing that with Sidus, head out to the lunar L1. So we actually get sunlight 24 hours a day, and we get a lot of benefits from that and the distance and what we're doing in terrestrial. But we'll get into that later on. No, but you're right. I mean, we need compute. And I love what Nokia were doing on this last mission with intuitive machines.
Yeah.
And what the guys at Lunar Outpost we're going to be testing with them, because the idea that we make a brand new space radio to go to the moon, no, you just take your iPhone or your Android phone, right? And this idea that, well, of course it works up there. Why?
Depends on the supply chain issues at the moment. I think it depends on which.
Well, that too. That's why I think the Indian Space Agency could come in and be brilliant with the new iPhones that are being made in India. That would be fantastic.
Right.
But we've got to take that with us. Now China has 2 data centers operational.
Yeah.
One on the moon, on the Chang'e 4 mission, tiny wee little data center, and one in orbit around the moon on the Dutch radio astronomy satellite they're doing with them. Edge processing.
Yeah.
Right? The same way we do processing edge here on the ground, you do the same thing up there. You be close to the action, process, and send the results home. Sorry. I can go down rabbit holes. Actually, they have a key piece of carrot cake here at the office, and every time I go down a rabbit hole, they point me at
I think we're renaming the podcast "Space Rabbit Holes" in the next chapter here, because that's kind of like where we go here. But you mentioned so much, frankly, in the course of that answer. I almost don't know where to take it apart. But I'll start with the terrestrial application, right? Because I think it's kind of interesting. It almost you and I have talked about this before, but you almost made sort of the comparison, the analogy to the so-called seed vault in Svalbard in terms of its potential application. But for those who don't know, it's a vault essentially buried beneath the ground in this archipelago just south of the North Pole that serves as sort of almost like a backup for the world's agricultural crops. The moon, in your estimation, is sort of the ultimate backup center in a way, or a backup locale. And I'm curious if you can kind of unpack that for me and explain why.
Well, the moon is so perfect for data storage. If it wasn't there, we'd have to build it. I mean, it's ideal. The access to power, cooling, the orbital dynamics of this, the Lagrange points as our next step are absolutely superb for this. And why? Well, you said it yourself. The seed vault on Svalbard Island, meant to protect all of humanity's greatest seeds for food for the next 1,000 years. Well, climate change, it melted, and they were flooded, and they almost lost everything. And so what we're looking at is terrestrial data and backing it up. Premium to start with. The problems that we're facing down here where data has all of its value are extreme. For everything from human error, it's the #1 cause of data loss on a daily basis, all the way through to nation state attacks on immutable data storage, or ransomwares. You've got problems on cable fiber, not just what you read in the press about people chopping up cable fiber coming off Svalbard Island. Right? It happens on the ground too. We're finding taps on everything. People injecting malware into data centers, and data centers run our entire modern civilization. We've come so close just on the cyber warfare a couple of times of losing everything that runs our modern civilization. So the idea is it has value here, but let's back it up somewhere else. Let's just take it up. And as we've been doing that and talking about that, you've seen a lot of other things change on the ground with data creation. And if I may, a couple of firsts. I saved it for you. We're actually checking this out, right? So when we started doing this, we saw the date back June 2023. The daily amount of data created by the human race in June 2023 was 2.5 quintillion bytes of information every day, more than yesterday.
It's hard to wrap your mind around it precisely how much that is.
I had to look it up, David. And that's like 1,000 petabytes. It's an exabyte a day. So it's a million MacBook Pros a day with a terabyte in each, every 24 hours. Now, the common wisdom was that was going to double every 2 years. We just had a black swan event, or was it a trend? So here we are. We're almost at June 2025, sorry. So we were like, oh, please, please, please let it doubled. Please let us be right. And we were expecting 5 quintillion bytes a day. And we just checked. And the audience, please check. Check yourselves. Anything I tell you, you can Google. Or ChatGPT, because it creates more data, which we have to back up. So we're now running at 402 quintillion bytes a day.
And
That's
then the concern then, though, is that the loss of that data and the sort of the loss of that knowledge base or knowledge, even potential for transfer, is very real in a way. I mean, and I think you've mentioned this in terms of precedents for this in terms of antiquity. Alexandria and the rest of it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of my favorite sort of analogies that you've had.
Oh, that largest data loss in human history that is so bad. We still talk about it 2,000 years later. It's still taught in schools. When Julius Caesar's troops burnt down the Library of Alexandria in the Roman Civil War. Right? And we're like going, whoa, my gosh, imagine if that was today, and it does almost happen. So we're now at 402 quintillion bytes a day.
But
That's,
I would push back in some sense because data centers on the moon clearly are much more difficult in terms of physical tampering. But one would think that if you're connected to the network in any capacity, you're still very much vulnerable to cyber attacks.
Oh, absolutely. No, David, you hit the nail on the head. Yes, absolutely. Which is why we're very fortunate at Lonestar with the other things we've done in our careers. We actually have an ITU filing with the moon as a reference body, the world's only commercial filing with 1,000 megs of KA, some X-band and some S-band, which actually gives us a completely, totally independent, isolated global network. And we work with our data center partners on the ground.
That's interesting.
So we actually don't touch the broken networks on the ground. We don't touch cable fiber. We don't touch public switching networks. And isn't it? Yeah, no, but you're right. See, that's the thing. We talk to people and say, oh, I have a backup in Seattle. I have one in New York. And I'm like, it's on the same network.
Right.
Hackers get into the network. They sit low and they see where all your backups are and take you down.
Yeah, and it could be on Mars or Saturn. It's the same network, essentially. We're talking about the same fundamental.
Well, that's just it. So, and that's just it.
Some latency there, admittedly, but
latency is a good thing. Latency is a very good thing on storage. On storage, latency is amazing.
Sure.
You want latency, which is why this new data center region of space. It's like going to a new part of the world. You go say, I'm going to open a new data center region. What is the unique physical attributes of this data center region, and what's the laws? And if you treat space as a data center region, oh my goodness, look at this. And then you have the amazing work of StarCloud, of Relativity now having made their announcement with Eric Schmidt. And I think there's a couple of others. I think Axiom, there's a couple of others out there doing this. Obviously, China's doing it too. But this idea of expanding, not replacing the Earth, but expanding compute into low Earth orbit, where you've got free power, free cooling, but you've also got very low latency communications. It's genius.
I think Eric Schmidt has actually said explicitly or expressly in a post that the play for Relativity was specifically for orbital data. And then there's the question of power sources too, in terms of like sort of that continuous solar power and other sources. But I want to get back to something that you said earlier in terms of China.
Sure.
The sort of in some ways the driving geopolitical rationale behind a lot of this sort of quote unquote next space race, and whether or not it's a space is contentious. Like depending on who you talk to, it's a broader competition. Races may end. Sort of outside of that scope. I've often grappled myself with questions of the quote unquote lunar economy, and one of the interesting sort of retorts that I've heard has been, if China is there, then an economy will inevitably exist with the U.S. in the sense of the competition geopolitically will bake into itself a degree of funding and in that sense sort of the nascent development of a market. Still, space companies are overwhelmingly, in terms of where the moon is centered, funded by taxpayers, and yet with this geopolitical competition that has some hallmarks to the first space race with the Soviet Union, at least in terms of the drive. A lot of differences, obviously, particularly in the sense of the commercial sector. But I wonder, in the context of China having 2 data centers in and around the moon at this point, what that says to you in terms of sort of long-term plays, long-term influence, technical infrastructure, and then sort of the rules of the road that start to emerge around this developing ecosphere?
Oh, no, so much to unpack there, David. That's an excellent question. Are we in the middle, or we are in the middle of a second Cold War, Cold War 2.0? And what does that mean? And the fact that, and China not only has 2 data centers on the moon, they have a patent for lunar data centers, global patent through the Shanghai Aerospace Engineering Institute. You can Google it. Not you personally, but the audience. Fascinating, right? They read the same books that we do.
Yeah.
They read the same speculative fiction that we do. They see the same strategic advantage of the high ground that we do. And they see also what's happening. I would suggest that while we sit there and debate the values of something and where should we do something, they just go do it and claim the high ground and claim the win. And that is massively upsetting. Look, Chinese people love them, their form of government, not so much, right? We're in an end game. If I'm going to put I'm going to swap the Lonestar hat and put the Institute of Space Commerce hat, because we're looking at this a lot. We're about to come out with something on this. We're in an end game right now for humanity. We're at a point where we either move from scarcity to abundance or stay in scarcity. We've got the energy and resources of space with space flight as a tool, just like fire is a tool, and just like AI is a tool to lift our civilization, lift our nations, and lift the free nations of the world. Team freedom, right? We have this opportunity, but team tyranny does too. They have the same tools. They're a little more monomaniacally focused. They know whoever controls geostationary orbit controls the world.
Yeah.
Whoever controls the moon controls geostationary orbit. It's just physics and military strategy. If anyone tells you otherwise, put them in touch with me. I'll have to start learning Chinese because they're going to enjoy their time in the prison camp.
In that sense,
we are at that point. Yeah. Well,
I think maybe sort of the natural pushback that I might hear, conversely, is that, the alternative side is more of this sort of consolidated, uber elite, tech-driven class of entrepreneurs that have captured policymaking in a way that we haven't seen before. And I wonder, is there a middle ground between these two stark realities here?
Well, I would say our greatest advantage, our only advantage right now, is our entrepreneurs, because we can move faster. That's the only thing we could do. Tapping into commercial markets to do something. Like I said, when we see the moon, we see Earth's largest satellite. We see fulfilling a terrestrial market, leveraging the physical properties and the orbits around the moon. But taking a couple, like I said, this is an end game situation. Alfred Thayer Mahan, influence of sea power upon history. When you look at the influence of sea power upon history, but what about the influence of space power upon history? I've got a bottle of water right here. Sorry. I'm getting so into this. This is a great question.
Yeah.
One I didn't expect. So I'm riffing a little bit. So the influence of space power upon history. So Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven wrote about this, as did Alfred Thayer Mahan. The size of the Roman Empire was dictated by 2 weeks' march from a body of water or from a Roman road. The size of the Great Khan's empire was dictated by how fast and how well his pony riders could go. The size of the British Empire early on and the Spanish Empire was dictated about how fast a ship could sail. How do you do command and control of the military and of governance? That then turned into steam. It turned into telegraph. It turned into radio. And here we are in the middle of this new Cold War, where we have satellite communications, which actually, given the size of a government, is determined by the size of the timing of speed of command and control. We can now have a global governance. Global governance. So what government?
There's a lot to unpack on that.
There's a lot to unpack, right? But the thing is, we see this, China sees this.
Yeah.
And they've got a massive demographic problem. They're down 400 million people in the next 25 years. The only people that will tell you it's China's century are the Chinese, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so they don't have enough people to run their factories, run their military, or even live in their cities.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point in the context that, one of the, arguably the advantages of the Chinese system when it comes to space is the continuity of strategic planning. That being said, when you look at sort of the demographic questions that China's facing, and perhaps long-term questions about continuity of its own leadership, because it strikes me that there was almost like this tacit bargain that was struck within China itself, in which groups would would deal with some of the more sort of draconian policies that came down from Beijing in exchange for an uplifting of quality of living. And once that sort of evens off a bit, these questions of sort of political want married with sort of the technical surveillance that is just being laid out in ways that we've never really seen before. I don't know. I wonder if there's a tension point there that will eventually show cracks,
Oh, sure.
and in and of itself show questions of continuity of those broader space policy initiatives that we're talking about here.
Oh, well, so now see, David, exactly. They've got all of the demographics we just talked about, problems there. We've got the problems of their surveillance state. They took Black Mirror as a guide, and 1984 from George Orwell, they saw that as a starter kit.
Sure.
But as we have seen in all of human history to date, the more a state crushes down on people, and at the same time, like with Lenin's new economic policies that Stalin had to like really jump on top to stop, the moment you bring economic liberalization into a command control economy dictatorship like China, the moment you do that, you start to create the pressure vessel that's going to explode around you.
Yeah.
Now, we saw that explosion with Gorbachev and everything else. It took a long time coming. But interestingly, space SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, with Jerry Pournelle, Larry Niven, Ronald Reagan, General Graham, all those guys, one of the key goals there was to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Stated goal. Oh, lovely dome we have coming up, don't we? So isn't it wonderful? But I look at this, and this is the thing. We're free people. We're chaos.
Like how you slipped that in there. Just ever
of course,
so
just suddenly slip. Well, from the Institute of Space Commerce, Larry and Jerry were there. Larry's our patron right now. Jerry, may he rest in peace, was our first patron. And so this idea of the role of space and high technology and global view, the high ground, protection, and for now, access to resources and energy from space. China's doing space-based solar power. We're rapidly trying to do the same thing. This idea that space was this thing that people used to look at, and was the Apollo program, and oh gosh, maybe I have a satellite thing somewhere. Today, it's intrinsic to everything we're doing.
Well, I mean, is it in that sense, is it really just a question of will and political wherewithal, or are there some? So when I look at the IM-2 mission and some of the difficulties that mission faced, and admittedly, it's trying to land in the most difficult place that I think what we've seen thus far, but the idea of human-rated landers landing there, and the idea of doing maintenance and dealing with hardware failures and life cycle management, and trying to sort of utilize the lunar regolith for construction, 3D printing and other materials, and how you bring things that like all of these things. I don't know that there's a general understanding about how fundamentally hard that is and will be. And maybe it's just a question of engineering and we'll all figure it out. And it's just, an obstacle that we just will hurdle. But I don't know.
How much trouble am I going to get myself in? I'll probably find out, right? Look, I love NASA. My wife's a retired NASA astronaut. We have several astronauts on our board and advisory boards. And I am passionate about NASA and its mission and everything it represents and everything it does. However, however, look, and I personally know very well, and they're great friends, the people who chose those landing sites. Minority Report coming in saying, guys, look, it's probably the worst place to be. We're finding water all over the moon. The mid latitudes are easier for comms. We have shelter in the lava tubes. So that removes all of these problems. And yes, there's the peak of eternal light. It's been this talisman that people have had for years. And it was like, during the wilderness, I talk about going back to the moon like Moses and the promised land. We had the promised land. We had it. We had it in the Apollo program, right? I remember in the Bible and Exodus, and God brings Moses to the promised land with the Israelites, and they go, it's got Canaanites. We don't want that. And he's like, right, you lot, 40 years in the desert, sort yourselves out. Right? That's what happened to us. We were at the promised land. We could have gone on to Mars. We could have all this energy, all this resources. We could have space-based solar power. We never would have destroyed our environment.
Yeah.
And why? So now we're finally back. And it's like, guys, so what do we need? We need shelter. Well, there's lava tubes. Incredible. Takes us out of the radiation, does all these great things for us. We kind of live in the moon. Oh, that's right. Arthur Clarke, 2001: A Space Odyssey. All those guys were like, yeah, that's what we should do. And the next thing you know, we're down at one of the hardest places. We're finding water all over the moon. I'm not saying the water isn't important, but when you're sending human beings, you can claim territory on the moon under the treaties and everything else. Not sovereignty. I teach space law.
Somewhat. It's a gray area.
Yeah, right. Right. It's a gray area, but the thing is, you can do that with unmanned, and that's what the Chinese have been doing.
Yeah. Chris,
Besides this,
I think we have
sorry,
to.
Anna. Oh,
I think we
no,
have to
we're
leave
up
it
on
there.
the
I could
time.
talk to you for the next 10 hours. I swear.
Oh, no,
But
I'd love this. Sorry. No, wait. So tangents, right? No. So whoever wins the moon wins the Earth, wins
Yeah.
energy and resource of scarcity to abundance. But also, when you're doing data, backing up your data from space at higher orbits, like the L1, like the moon, and doing the compute in low Earth orbit, that's the holy grail. And Star Cloud and Relativity and all the others doing this, amazing. But that's compute, low latency. Storage, come see us. We do sovereign storage. We know how to do it. We've already done it. We've got all that ready to go. And that's what we do. And looking forward to it too. David, thank you.
Chris Stott, Lonestar Data Holdings. It is always a pleasure talking with you. I never know where the conversations go from biblical references to the Roman Empire to landing and putting data centers on the moon. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, David.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, we have had a flurry of commercial activity when it comes to space investment, not least of which, the one I was paying attention to was Voyager Technologies, which I think in their debut trading day ended up like 82% up. This is on a $383 million raise. And it just, it's just kind of an interesting landscape in like how this is unfolding and maybe how it's unfolding a little bit unevenly. And I'm just curious, like how you've been paying attention to it.
Right. I mean, we've talked a little bit in the last couple of months about, the optimism that there is within the space industry right now, that they feel like, hey, there's a lot of opportunity, that we are hearing from investors in ways that maybe we haven't heard from in the past. And they're even showing up at, traditional space conferences and becoming a little bit of a stir there. But, the last couple of weeks, we're only, about 2-3 weeks into June here, but we've heard from Lookup, which is a French space situational awareness company. They raised nearly $60 million to work on a radar network to track space objects. We heard from Yuan Space that they had raised about $90 million to acquire Starlight engines. We heard from Quantum Space that they'd raised about $40 million to advance development of their Ranger spacecraft. And then the big one was Voyager, which you mentioned, and that they had their IPO and looked really good there for those first couple of days. So I think there is this optimism. I think it comes against this backdrop of, particularly here in Washington, where there's been a real fight for more money for the Space Force and for national security. There's been obviously a pretty devastating NASA budget proposal. So it's trying to square those two things. But I think the play in all this, appears to be Golden Dome. We heard from Quantum that they thought they had an angle there. Voyager has talked a lot about Golden Dome. And so I think that could be the one point that maybe is giving folks the optimism that they need. We knew that if there was going to be increased spending on space, it was likely going to come from the national security realm. Golden Dome appears to be that vehicle, and so I think that's why maybe we're seeing that commitment right now to new space companies or newer space companies that hadn't played in this arena as actively before.
Yeah. Heavy on defense, heavy on commercial. I think also the fact that there's this sort of looming understanding that the ISS is going away in 2030 is that it still has some primacy to these commercial space stations, which there is a market for in terms of some of the pharmaceutical and other sort of existing markets where you can kind of do newfangled research that reaches a consumer base already in space. We talked about kind of like the value of a cislunar or a lunar economy and kind of where that's driven. That's unclear to me, but it's pretty light on planetary science and astronomy these days in terms of the NASA budget. And, admittedly, those are two areas that traditionally rely on the federal government almost exclusively, right? Not saying
Yeah.
that the defense and commercial don't, but just, it's a hard use case in terms of a consumer market. This is more like long lead stuff. But I thought the news with Quantum in terms of Ranger spacecraft was really interesting because this was a spacecraft that had been oriented in and around the moon, and there has been some questions about how it would be used for Mars sample return and sort of like the broader almost like the constant sort of where are we going? And let's get ahead of that in terms of the commercial space. But I think what struck me with all this, and you and I have talked about Golden Dome quite a bit, is like,
Oh yeah.
what does it mean? What does it mean when there's a shift of a public-private alignment in the space agenda that's oriented towards space infrastructure being framed as national security? Because
Yeah.
that is a departure than what we've seen in recent years. And it almost is like all of these companies that were just kind of like, where's the money? Where we need to go and find it so that we can do our own sort of research and development. They're finding it in security. And like, what does that mean in the context of a broader geopolitical competition with China and some of these other upstart countries that when it's framed in this almost like this new Cold War type of mindset, and like, how does that manifest, and what are the consequences of that long term? And does this carry through administrations? Just it provokes a whole range of questions. And this is not to say that access to space has always been somewhat reliant on national security. I mean, the
Oh, sure.
Apollo program was clearly defined in those terms. But we got away from that for a period of time, and it just seems like it's back now.
Yeah, I didn't expect the conversation to take this turn, but I had the same thought this morning, and I was reading some of our China coverage, and maybe a decade ago or longer, there was this thought that hey, whatever China had in space, that was part of their national security apparatus, and that felt, maybe naively, but very different from how the U.S. military and talked about its space
Yeah.
apparati. It would there appeared to be a clear separation there, and
Yeah.
I think what you talked about and what we're seeing with national security driving this investment and creating new opportunities for companies that maybe weren't as active before, or particularly as active in the defense and national security realm, is that those lines are getting blurred. It's hard to tell, like, oh, should we think of these guys as
Right.
defense, or should we think of them as something else? And that's when we start talking about space as a warfighting domain, that those blurry lines they get very difficult, and it's a real challenge. And so um, how that takes place over the next, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, it seems like that's not something that there will be less of. That seems that those lines of demarcation are they're down, and they're probably not going to be built up again in the same way. But um,
But in
yeah,
that
it's
same
it's
context, like there's almost like this commercial paradigm shift in a way. Like you mentioned, Dawn Aerospace, which kind of
yeah,
announced its first order of its Aurora suborbital space plane. Um, and what I thought what was most interesting about that news was that it would sell the vehicle directly to customers who would operate it themselves. So it's like we're in this DIY or DIY DIY DIY.
DIY.
Yeah, thank you. Space in which, it just, I don't know. I don't know how as a regulator you keep pace with this. I don't know as a as commercial upstart, like where you're looking and sort of what governs this realm that just hadn't existed before in terms of this direct to market type of modality, and yet here we
Yeah,
are. That mixing with the emphasis on national security, the emphasis also, and we've mentioned this a lot about, AI systems increasingly, being targeted for being put on orbit, and how that sort of directly relates to, a global economy that's increasingly run on orbit. All of this kind of has this sense that like space is front and center right now, and yet it's being kind of pushed in certain directions, national security, commercial upstart. And I wonder, like, is there a danger there if you don't necessarily have the kind of the broader oversight or the broader sort of regulatory authority of getting in front of these things, which is always hard when you have newfangled technologies, because it's almost like, they go out there first and the regulators try to catch up. But obviously in this administration, that's less a part of the game here.
That's funny you said, because when I was getting my notes ready before the show, I wrote down that it feels right now like a jump ball, right? Like it's kind of like, hey, whoever gets there first, or whoever can find a way to get there first, that's where the money may be, that's where the technology may be, that's where the best opportunities could be. And um it is hard to feel like, hey, this is the path, and there are guardrails, and there are guidelines, because right now it does not seem like there's a traditional way for a space company to succeed. I think and it's probably like that for the entire economy, right? That there are
Right.
fewer and fewer traditional ways to succeed, that you got to make it work however it happens. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in space, and particularly with these rounds of investments that we've been talking about.
And there are consequences. I mean, the next story we were going to talk about, this is something I kind of like glommed onto, but there are consequences
Yeah.
in terms of rapid commercial growth, and even the most successful space company in history being SpaceX, and its Starlink satellite constellation. And there was just a recent study put out that said Starlink satellites, they're not only having trouble with some of the solar flares in terms of like staying on orbit there in a way that may not have been expected, but also leaking more radiation than their predecessors, as much as 30 times more radio waves than their predecessors. And the reason why that's important is not only its disruption of radio astronomy, because obviously like there are a lot of these satellites on orbit, in excess of, think of 7,500, with thousands more planned. And
Yep.
large satellite constellations can generate, or do generate, this sort of electromagnetic noise that creates that sort of additional source of like interference for radio astronomers. And so that's important for a couple of different reasons. Not only like in terms of how we view the night sky, but there are real values in terms of how we do this, not least of which is asteroid detection. So, as we kind of go forward and push, push the envelope in terms of commercial investment, military investment, broader competition, both domestically and internationally, there are, questions, I think, about maybe strategic blind spots in the nature of that expansion, and the sort of the tension that exists between private innovation and growth of a commercial sector, which a lot of people obviously want. But then there's this question of the public scientific interest, which, if you look at this, there are real questions, particularly in light of some of the funding cuts we've seen at NASA. So, it's we've talked about this before, that the nature of sort of the uneven development of space. It's not guns blazing in every direction. It's very
That's
targeted,
right.
and there are potential consequences if they're not mitigated.
Yeah, and I think what I sometimes forget is, because it feels like old hat, that we Starlink launches again, or it again, and we just are like, oh yeah, of course it's working, it's up there, it's doing what it's supposed to do. But you forget that this is the first time there's been this many satellites on orbit. It's the first time, by a large margin. And so we don't always know what to expect. And I think that's in part what makes this so interesting, is that we can take it for granted, like, oh yeah, this is working as we expect. But when there are um, side effects like this, that I think sometimes they can be forgotten, and that's why it's important to highlight stories like this.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, great. Well, let us know where you think the next round of investment might go, specifically towards what kind of technologies you're interested in. We're at Space Minds at spacenews.com. Thanks so much for listening and for watching. I'm Mike Bruce.
I'm David Ariosto. You've been watching and listening to Space Minds.